A group of senior African academics have come out in defense of Adam Habib, that's the newly appointed director of London's School of Oriental and African Studies and the former vice-chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand here in South Africa. Habib's use of the N-word during a webinar was followed by a subsequent vote of no confidence in his leadership and student outrage. Habib then stepped aside on the 18th of March after an external investigation into that incident. Some of the academics say there was no bad intent in Habib's use of that word. For context and perhaps analysis about how we should be looking at this, let's bring in Professor Ahmed Bauer. He's the CEO of University South Africa, joining us via our video link. Prof, always great to get your insights on these issues and many other related ones. Great to have you on the program as well. So at the heart of the furore, or furore, however it's pronounced, was the issue of intent. I wonder how much that matters in this context, and perhaps it does.
Ayanda, thank you for having me on the program. Look, this is a really difficult matter in some respects, but in other respects, it's a very simple matter, I think. First of all, it wasn't a webinar. It was a meeting between the incoming director of the School of Oriental and African Studies and student leaders. I mean, it was a kind of an engagement between the two parties. One has to just come to grips with the idea that what Adam Habib did was to respond to a question that was put to him, which the question was, why isn't the university taking action against somebody who used the N-word in his or her lecture? Adam Habib's kind of response was, if somebody did use the N-word in such a context in a lecture, then there has to be some kind of process to unfold exactly what happened, and action will be taken. So it's a completely different use of the use of the N-word. It certainly isn't a derogatory use. It isn't aimed at an individual. It's a response to a question. Now that raises a more serious question, because it is about saying, what does it mean for the space of intellectual discourse, if you like, at an institution like the School of Oriental and African Studies, if there's a huge furore over the use of a word that should really then become the source of some kind of internal discourse, rather than kind of the immediate call, the call for the immediate firing of the director, if you like, of the school. So from my point of view, at least, there's two or three issues here. The one is just the issue around what does this mean for the School of Oriental and African Studies if it doesn't allow this kind of discourse to kind of unfold, if you like, about the use of particular words and so on. But secondly, and more importantly, it is about just understanding that the context did not actually warrant, any action being taken against the person, simply on the basis that it was a response to a question, not the use of the word against somebody else. So it does raise critical questions about the nature of discourse, if you like, at that particular institution.
Right.
Just to say that the University of Chicago, I just use this as an example. University of Chicago says, if you want a safe space, if you want a place where you are protected from voices that you might not like to hear, then please don't come here, because the University of Chicago is not a safe space. And that's really at the heart of this idea that universities should be spaces for intellectual discourse.
Yeah, it's interesting, and perhaps we'll try go through this systematically as you've put it out. Insofar as discourse is concerned, I guess part of the questions that need to be posed is, could Adam Habib have made his point without using the word itself, given, as you mentioned, that was a conversation taking place not necessarily in an academic engagement, but in an engagement about academic issues, if that makes sense. It was more an operational discussion than a discussion taking place, for instance, to teach.
Yeah, so I think that, there's an issue there, which is that this is actually a conversation within the university. So it's not a conversation, outside of the university. So that's the first point to be made. The second point to be made is that, he kind of almost immediately kind of said, if there are people whose sensibilities have been, affected by this, then I apologize. So now, whether he should have apologized to doctors is another matter. But for me, the big question is, what does it say about the institution if there isn't the space for a conversation to occur around the use of particular words or ideas that are put on the table and so on? So it really does speak to the closing down of kind of intellectual space, if you like. Now, whether the use of the verbalization of the use of the N-word is problematic or not is a discussion that needs to be had at the institution. It's not something that should really result in kind of the killing of a voice, if you like.
I mean, I'm sure you'll agree, Prof, that not all conversations that take place in academic spaces are academic conversations. There's a distinction to be made there, a thin line to be drawn, if you like. And I wonder whether there's consensus around whether that engagement itself was an academic conversation or a conversation taking place in an academic space. Because if I was to come to you as a professor to confide in you about my challenges as a student, for instance, it's a conversation taking place on academic premises, but it's not necessarily an academic conversation itself. And what is said then, I think, will be responded differently once we've been able to categorize this. Is there consensus from your reading of the situation about at least that matter?
Yeah, so look, I think that there's a very close intersection, between those two domains, if you like, and I think you're right to pose the idea of the two domains. But there's a very close interaction between them, because it's not just about the words that are used or the ideas that are put on the table and so on. It's about the nature of a university as a knowledge-intensive institution, as a place where young people come, and engage with professors and so on, in a spirit of kind of really growing intellectually and so on. So there's a kind of a very sharp, not a sharp, I should say, a very close intersection between those spaces. I mean, so, and the one thing we say in South Africa all the time is, please pay attention to what's happening in the second curriculum, everything that happens outside the universe, outside of the classroom, because it's there that most of the learning takes place, if you like. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but it is about saying that the university as a space should be a space that kind of allows for, for disagreements to be kind of engaged in an intellectual fashion, if you like.
Yeah. Ironically, this runs the risk of being quite an intellectual conversation itself. But let's speak about how we do that carefully and with consideration of where we are. Academics and academic spaces don't exist in vacuums. They're embedded in a social, historic context. And, ignoring that leads us to the type of pitfall, some would argue, that Adam Habib has found himself in. What this teachable moment perhaps has given us an opportunity to do is to press on a whole lot more emphasis on that aspect of how the second curriculum takes place, as you put it.
So that's a really good question, and I think it's a really important question. So let me just begin by saying that, academic freedom, like all other freedoms, come with responsibility. They're not just there, they're not just kind of given to individuals, and for individuals to kind of think of them, the freedoms and themselves as islands, if you like, that they are embedded, if you like, in a relationship between the freedom and the responsibility. Now, when universities engage in discourses around whatever it might be, there has to be kind of a clear understanding that discourse needs to be based on academic, on the ideas, on the principles that govern the academic enterprise, if you like. Now, again, it takes us back to the question that you raised, which is a group of students and maybe others, deeply offended by the verbalization of the N-word by Adam Habib. The question then is, how does the university deal with that? How does it kind of really engage with that idea? And how many of these words are we going to, prevent people from verbalizing? I mean, so that needs to be an engagement rather than, in the spirit of academic freedom, that should be an engagement rather than a closing down of space, because the closing down of the space is completely antithetical to the purpose of institutions like SOAS.
Can we do both very quickly? Can we have the conversation continue whilst Adam Habib, as a placeholder, is asked to also reckon with ways through which some people may have been offended? In my mind, those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
Yes, no, I fully agree with that. And by the way, the purpose of such a discourse would be precisely to arrive at that kind of understanding, if you like, of, in the context of academic freedom, just, what are the implications for, the verbalization of words like the N-word and so on. I mean, and by the way, there are hundreds of other, considerations in terms of this dialectic, if you like, that need to be taken into account.
It's a fascinating discussion. It's a pity because it always will become incredibly complex, because the nature of what academics have to do is to speak about the societies that they find themselves in. It's quite a cumbersome exercise at the very least. Professor Ahmed Bauer, thanks very much. Always enjoy engaging you. He's the CEO of University South Africa. Once again, thanks very much indeed.